My name is Celia Hartman. I'm 30 years old, Director of Cyber Integration for the Department of Defense. And tomorrow morning, I'll walk into a high-level defense contract meeting at Langford Systems, the same company where my father once held a corner office, and my brother still walks around like he built the foundation with his own hands. They don't know I'll be there. More importantly, they don't know I'll be running it. I am the Pentagon liaison on Project Valor, with final sign-off authority on every phase of implementation. And as of tomorrow at 0900, the people who once told me I was just following wires will find out I was building the map. But tonight, I'm back in the same house I left 5 years ago without a proper goodbye. My mother texted to invite me to a family dinner. Nothing special, just Eli's been promoted again, thought you might want to come. She always phrases it like an offer, like an obligation wrapped in politeness. I never said I'd show, but I rented a black SUV anyway and drove the 6 hours home over roads I'd once dreamed of disappearing from. The driveway was narrower than I remembered. My old Toyota used to slide in with space to spare, but the SUV looked out of place next to Mum's minivan, shiny, unfamiliar like me. I sat in the car with the engine off, letting the heater hum itself quiet. My hands were dry, steady. Military calm, they'd call it. But my stomach still churned like it used to before field briefings, like my body remembered what it meant to walk into a space where you're both invisible and under a microscope. The porch light was on. The welcome mat was the same. Home is where the heart is faded lettering and all. The chipped step creaked under my foot as I reached the door. I rang the bell out of habit. Celia Mom's voice came from the kitchen. She didn't open the door. It's open. Of course it was. Inside smelled like rosemary and floor polish. The framed photo wall greeted me like it always had. Eli at graduation, Eli's wedding, Eli's sons. No trace of me. Not in uniform, not even the photo from my commissioning ceremony that I mailed to Mom, with a handwritten note, "Wish you could be there." But tucked near the bottom, half hidden behind a crooked photo of Eli's boys, was a small square drawing I hadn't seen in years. One of mine. A sketch I made for Avery when we were 15, back when we used to pass notebooks instead of speaking truths out loud. Avery Hartman, my younger cousin. Quiet, careful, always watching. The only one who ever wrote back. We hadn't seen each other since I left, but every few months, a link would show up in my inbox. Thought this might interest you. No message. Just art. Just care. I stepped into the kitchen. Mum was slicing green beans without looking up. Dinner's almost ready. Eli and Meryl are on their way. You won't believe it, he's leading the entire cyber systems team now. That's great, Mum, I said, because I knew the script. She'd never ask what I'd been doing. She just needed me to say the right lines so she could feel like everything was still okay. Eli arrived exactly on time, like always. Every inch of him looked like a resume printed in human form. He wore the kind of navy blazer that said promotion ready, and his handshake with Dad was the kind of firm that's more performance than connection. My older brother had never been late to anything in his life. School interviews, accolades, especially not praise. He was the golden son, moulded perfectly to fit every expectation our parents had ever imagined. MBA before 26, hired straight into Dad's company, rose through systems architecture like it was a staircase built just for him. He spoke like he'd already read the minutes of the conversation before you opened your mouth. And in this house that made him a prophet, "He's going places," she added. That phrase always felt like a train I missed. These days, it just sounded like static. The dining room was set for 6. No place cards, but the seating was always implied. Eli at the head dad on the right, Mum between them. I was usually tucked at the end. Not unwelcome, just unnecessary. They arrived on time, as always. Eli wore a blazer that said corporate but chill, and Meryl brought a bottle of wine that no one liked, but everyone pretended to. He gave me a quick hug, eyes already scanning the room for Dad. Hey, Cece, long time. 5 years, I said. He blinked like he couldn't tell if I was joking. I wasn't. Dinner was roast beef, mashed potatoes, and the same store-brand salad, dressing from when I was 10. Eli led the conversation, effortlessly team, growth revenue bumps, exciting military partnerships. I said nothing. I didn't need to. Every word he said was a setup for tomorrow's reveal. Mum set down a bowl of mashed potatoes, like it was an offering to the table gods. Then she looked at me with that soft, scripted smile, the one she reserved for checkout clerks and uncomfortable relatives. Still doing that army thing, sweetie? She asked like I was clinging to a childhood hobby. I nodded neutral. Yes, still doing that thing. Must be hard, she said, not hearing me. No real roots, no long-term path, just moving base to base like, what do they call it? Nomadic. Dad didn't look up from his plate. So you're still a captain then? Something like that, I replied, feeling the weight of the silver eagle folded upstairs, the one they'd never bothered to ask about. He grunted. Well, rank inflation is a real thing nowadays. Doesn't mean what it used to. Then came Eli swirling his wine like he'd earned the vineyard. Man, I couldn't do it. Just taking orders all day. No vision, no ownership. Must be frustrating, huh? He smirked. But hey, some people are built to execute. Others lead. His wife giggled softly like he'd made a joke. At least it keeps you busy, he added, spearing a carrot. Not everyone's cut out for long-term strategy. But you always were good at following instructions. I felt my jaw tense, but I didn't flinch. They weren't being cruel by accident. They were skilled in this. Polished. Precise. This was the kind of dismissal you couldn't argue with because it was dressed in manners served warm with dinner. You know, Dad added, wiping his mouth, we always thought you'd settle down eventually. Get a stable job. Maybe even circle back to civilian tech. There's still time, you know. I blinked. Time for what? He smiled like I'd missed something obvious. To build a real career. I didn't answer. I'd written the architecture for 2 national defence systems and authored 3 of the protocols his company was currently bidding to adopt. But tonight wasn't about defending myself. Tonight was theirs. After dinner, I wandered into the den. The same couch, the same beige carpet. Dad was talking football with Eli. Mum cleared the plates in the kitchen. No one noticed I'd left. No one ever did. Upstairs, my old room still had the yellow walls and corkboard pinned with high school honour roll slips. There were no certificates from my work in Israel, no commendations from my deployment with NATO. The quilt Grandma sewed was still on the bed, tucked in like I'd never left. I sat down and opened my suitcase. There it was, the midnight blue uniform, creased sharp ribbons, polished eagle insignia catching the light. Tomorrow, they'd all see me, and no one would be able to talk over it. I folded it back carefully, as if I were putting away a piece of truth too heavy to carry all at once. Then I looked around the room that used to belong to a girl they believed in, until she decided to believe in herself. The yellow walls were exactly as I'd left them, same soft light from the desk lamp, same posters of constellations and half-torn academic decathlon flyers. On the shelf sat my junior science fair trophies still gleaming with misplaced nostalgia. One of them had a little label, regional finalist, neural networking models. I'd won it in 10th grade. Dad never came to see it happen. That weekend, Eli had a basketball game. I walked over to the corkboard untouched since high school. A faded SAT prep schedule acceptance letters from Caltech and MIT. The note from the brown STEM immersion program was still pinned there too, its edges curled with time. I reached behind it half on instinct. Still there, a tiny folded origami star. Avery had slipped it into my locker the day I left. No words, just a small blue star with glitter, nail-polished dots like her way of saying, I see you even if no one else does. My fingers brushed the old bookshelf. Mostly paperbacks now bent with age. In the middle sat a copy of my final research report from the ROC scholarship year. I'd sent one home in a manila envelope. No one had ever mentioned it. I guess I wasn't surprised it ended up buried between a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird and some forgotten algebra workbook. I sat on the bed and felt the patchwork quilt beneath me. Grandma had sewn it when I was 10, a kaleidoscope of deep reds, burnt orange and navy blue. She always said those were strong colours for a girl who'd never follow a weak path. She passed before she saw me swear in. I think she would have understood. The house was silent now. Dinner laughter had faded, replaced by the creaks and clicks of old wood settling. Downstairs, Dad was probably polishing off his second Scotch Eli, explaining some AI concept to Mum with that easy arrogance he carried like cologne. I didn't need to hear them to know the rhythm. Some patterns never shifted. I lay back, eyes to the ceiling. The overhead light still made that faint humming sound I used to fall asleep to. For a moment, I could almost forget who I had become, almost slip into the version of me this house had frozen in amber, the one they loved as long as she stayed predictable. A soft knock tapped the doorframe. I turned my head. Avery stood there in a hoodie too big for her frame, her hair half tucked behind her ears. She didn't speak, just offered the ghost of a smile and tiptoed in holding something small in her hand. A folded piece of paper. She placed it gently on the pillow beside me like it might crumble if handled too roughly. I never stopped reading your work, she whispered, barely louder than the breath that carried it. I looked at her eyes, catching just a shimmer of truth in hers. Avery had always been the quiet one, the one who drew portraits on napkins and left notes in books, returned to the library. When I left for ROC, she was 15. Too young to leave, too aware to ignore what was happening. She didn't wait for me to answer, just squeezed my wrist briefly and left the door, clicking softly behind her. I picked up the note. Her handwriting was small and precise. I still have your email about the encryption project. I didn't understand all of it, but I remember how it made me feel like I wanted to build something too. I'm proud of you. I always have been. I held it to my chest for a long minute, the silence thicker now, but not so lonely. This house had erased me from its narrative, smoothed out my edges until I didn't fit the family photo anymore. But someone had remembered. Someone had seen me all along, and tomorrow so would the rest of them. Still lying in that old bed, I stared at the ceiling like it could open and show me where it all started when exactly I stopped being enough. The ceiling fan spun in slow, lazy circles, and I let my mind drift back to the days when I still believed effort equaled love. I was 8 the first time I beat Eli at something that mattered. It was the county-wide math challenge, long division, logic puzzles and number theory. I wasn't supposed to enter. Mum said it would be too much pressure that I should focus on creative things. But my 3rd grade teacher saw me solving algebra by accident and insisted I go. I placed first. Eli came in 6th. Dad said nothing. At dinner, the only congratulations came from my grandma. She slipped me a butterscotch candy under the table like it was a medal. Eli got a pizza party the next weekend for working hard, even if it wasn't first place. That was the pattern. I didn't notice it at first, how praise was rationed, how my success had to be quiet, contained, manageable. Eli brought home a B+ in chemistry and got an ice cream run. I got an A+ and a reminder to fix your handwriting next time. When I got into the regional STEM camp, Mum asked if I was sure I wanted to be away from the family that long. Eli got into basketball camp 2 towns over, and they threw him a going-away breakfast with pancakes shaped like footballs. I still remember watching the syrup pool on his plate, wondering if love tasted like maple. By high school, the double standard wasn't subtle anymore. Eli failed his physics final junior year. I offered to tutor him, but Dad told me not to be condescending. That same semester, I was selected to present my first prototype at the National Cyber Youth Forum. I paid for the flight myself. No one came. They said the timing didn't work with Eli's state championship game. It wasn't just neglect, it was erasure. Like they needed me to be competent but invisible. Eli was the headline, I was the footnote. Once, after winning a statewide award for a neural interface model I built from scratch, I brought the certificate home, holding it like proof I existed. Dad glanced at it and said, "That's nice, but Eli's robotics club is presenting next week. Maybe you could help him polish his slides." I remember that moment, not just for the hurt, but for how quietly it settled into me. A lesson learned without anyone having to say it out loud. If it isn't his achievement, it doesn't count. There was one night, my sophomore year. I'd just come back from a citywide science expo. My team placed first. I walked into the kitchen, flushed from the cold and high on the adrenaline of having done something that felt real. But Mum and Dad were already at the table deep in conversation about Eli's latest breakthrough, a B- on a test he thought he'd fail. They didn't ask how my day went, didn't notice the ribbon still pinned to my jacket. I went to the garage, sat on the cold cement floor between the old lawnmower and the bins of Christmas lights, and cried. Avery found me. She must have been around 10. She didn't ask anything, didn't try to hug me or offer advice. She just sat beside me on the concrete knees, pulled up to her chest, her shoulder brushing mine. We stayed there like that for what felt like an hour. I never forgot it. Not because of what she said, she didn't say anything, but because she stayed. And in this family presence was the rarest gift. That garage moment became a quiet touchstone I carried through the years. Whenever I felt like I was unraveling, I remembered that soft silence, the warmth of being witnessed even when words weren't possible. Avery, in her stillness, gave me something my parents never did space to feel, without needing to explain it away. By the time I graduated from high school, I had a full-ride offer from a top-tier tech institute. I got into the Defense Cyber Apprenticeship Program. I was already writing code that would one day evolve into federal network protection. And yet, at my graduation dinner, all Dad could talk about was how Eli had landed a summer internship at Langford Systems. He raised a glass to the future of the Hartman name. I didn't raise mine. I kept building anyway. In labs, in late-night coding sessions, in dorm rooms thick with burnt coffee and ambition. I stopped waiting for them to see me. And the day I walked across the stage at my military commissioning, I didn't look into the crowd for familiar faces. There weren't any. But I still remember the email that hit my inbox 2 days later. It was from Avery. She'd found a photo from the event online, me in full uniform, standing straight-backed and smiling, like the weight of the silence had finally shifted somewhere else. Her message was just one line. "You looked like someone I'd follow into battle." I saved that one. Now, lying in the room of my erased girlhood, I thought of that again, thought of every time I was made to shrink so someone else could shine. But tomorrow I wouldn't need the light from anyone else. I'd bring my own. That thought lingered, like a breath held too long. I turned the old desk lamp off and let the dark settle around me, wrapping me in memory. Because before I learned to stop asking for their approval, I tried one last time to earn it. I was 19, just back from my first internship with the DARPA Civilian Division. I had developed a predictive algorithm that could isolate cyber breaches within milliseconds, a model that, if scaled, could change how government networks responded to real-time attacks. I wasn't just proud. I was electrified by what it could mean. I printed the white paper, bound it neatly, and highlighted the practical implications. Then I asked my dad if we could talk. He was in his home office nursing his second coffee and scanning shareholder projections. I placed the paper on his desk and said, "I think Langford Systems could build this. It could help the DoD real contracts, real impact." He glanced at the front page. Didn't even flip it open. "You're getting ahead of yourself," he said. "That's not how these things work." "It's already functional," I said. "I've tested it against simulated networks. It holds. I could walk you through, he chuckled. That slow, low chuckle he used when he was about to teach someone their place. Celia, he said, you're smart. But you don't have real-world experience yet. You're not ready to lead anything. If you want to be taken seriously in defense tech, do it the right way. Get your MBA, join one of our partner firms, work under someone who understands scale. I wanted to ask why Eli never had to prove himself first. Why did he get leadership training just for showing up while I was building systems that worked? But I didn't. I just nodded and left the paper there. It sat on his desk for a week. Eventually, it disappeared. Probably ended up in the trash. That was the last time I brought him an idea. And the last time I let myself believe I could earn my place by impressing him. 2 weeks later, I applied for the Cross-Continental Cyber Defense Fellowship, a 2-year immersive program operating between Tel Aviv, Brussels, and Seoul. They only accepted 5 applicants a year. I got in. I didn't tell anyone. Not my parents, not Eli, not even my mother, who still called me her practical child, like it was both a compliment and a warning. There was only one person I wrote to Avery. It was a handwritten letter, the kind you write when you know you're not coming back the same. I folded it into thirds, slipped in a printed photo of me, standing in front of a server bank in DC, and left it inside a sketchbook on her bookshelf. I didn't say goodbye to anyone else, just her. In the letter, I told her the truth. I was tired of being a footnote in my own story, that I didn't want to spend the next 10 years diminishing myself just so the people around me wouldn't feel small. I told her I was scared, but I was going anyway, and I asked her gently to remember me not as the one who left, but as the one who finally chose herself. She never replied, but 3 years later when I visited DC for a conference, I saw her name on a local artist's showcase. I didn't attend, but I looked up her work online. The centerpiece was a black and blue ink drawing of a girl stepping onto a train. Her face turned away, the skyline melting behind her like watercolor. It was titled Launch Sequence. I knew it was me, and I knew, somehow, that letter had found a home. What my parents never understood, what Eli never had to confront, was that I didn't leave out of anger. I left because the silence was killing me faster than the distance ever could. Staying would have meant shrinking, and I had already done enough of that in their presence. Overseas, I thrived. I built the same algorithm from that rejected white paper into a live protocol that now guards critical intelligence assets across 4 NATO countries. I learned how to speak in boardrooms, how to hold my ground with 5-star generals and CEOs twice my age. I built a name one they didn't know and didn't need to. But Avery always knew. Years later, she told me she kept that letter in a small tin box under her bed, said she reread it whenever she needed to remember that it was okay to want more than quiet compliance. She called it my permission slip. I never asked her why she never showed it to anyone. I didn't need to. In a family like ours, silence was its own kind of armor. Speaking up meant a fracture. And Avery wasn't built for fracture, not then. But tomorrow she'd see me take up space with no apologies. And maybe that would be her permission too. The thing about vanishing from your own narrative is that you don't just disappear, you evolve where no one's watching. And, if you're lucky, you build yourself in peace. While Eli was learning how to delegate and Dad was fine-tuning spreadsheets, I was learning how to intercept attacks that could bring down entire governments. The fellowship sent me from Tel Aviv to Brussels to Seoul, and in each city I wrote lines of code that would one day hold a perimeter stronger than any wall they'd ever built at Langford Systems. It was in Brussels where it happened. A breach attempt, sophisticated, multi-pronged, embedded in a Trojan software update. We caught it before it could tunnel into 2 NATO defense systems. I still remember the moment my hands flying across the keyboard, heart pounding not from panic but purpose. I'd trained for this. I led the firewall response protocol while directing 2 teams in 3 time zones. We sealed the breach in 21 minutes. 21 minutes that saved infrastructure credibility and possibly lives. I was 27. That day, I received a commendation from Allied Command Operations. My name was printed in a sealed internal report. The media never knew. The public didn't cheer. But in a closed conference room lit by buzzing fluorescents, a 4-star general shook my hand and said, "You're going to change how we defend this country." I didn't cry. I didn't need to. I finally felt seen. 3 months later, I was recruited back to the US by the Department of Defense. They gave me the title Director of Integrated Security Systems. I was the youngest in the division by 8 years. I led a team of 32. Half of them didn't know what to make of me until I started showing up in Pentagon briefings with polished slides, sharper questions, and answers no one else could reach fast enough. I never sent my parents a notice, no announcement, no article forwarded with a hopeful caption. I stopped offering proof to people who had already made up their minds. But I did keep one person in the loop even if she never replied. Avery. I'd send her quiet links. A YouTube video from a defense tech panel where I gave a keynote. A photo from an academic journal's feature on women in cyber leadership. Once, I even mailed her a challenge coin I received after designing a protocol that helped secure a federal voting system. She never acknowledged them, but she didn't return them either. What I didn't know until much later, what made me sit down and blink back something sharp behind my eyes, was that she saved everything. She had a folder on her computer labeled North Star. It held screenshots, saved pages, even a few audio snippets from podcasts I'd guested on under my title. She followed my ascent like someone tracing constellations. Quietly, faithfully, never publicly. They wouldn't understand, she whispered to herself once, when I asked why she never showed our family, not the way it deserves to be understood. She wasn't wrong. At every Sunday dinner, they toasted Eli's budget increases and promotions like small gods handing down blessings. If Avery had stood up and said Celia's leading national defense protocols, they might have smiled politely, nodded vaguely, and turned back to the roast chicken. It wasn't malicious. It was myopia, the kind that makes you blind to what doesn't serve your narrative. But Avery saw me. In every headline she bookmarked, in every PDF she tucked away, in every moment she whispered, "You were right to go." I don't know if she ever told anyone how she used to pause family conversations whenever someone made a jab at Celia the soldier or our wandering cousin. Maybe she just sipped her drink and looked at the floor hands tight around the glass, waiting for the moment to pass. But I know this when my name came up on the Project Valor roster, listed as Pentagon liaison, and Langford Systems saw that the final approval would come from me. I imagined her alone in her room, staring at that screen, whispering, "She made it." And this time, I wasn't going to hide from that pride. I was going to walk in full uniform, polished buttons, and take my seat at the table they never thought I'd reach. Because the woman they didn't watch became, she was about to change everything. The morning of the meeting, I woke up before the alarm. The sky outside my window was the kind of cold, pale grey that doesn't offer comfort or judgment, just neutrality. I showered, dressed, and stood in front of the mirror, adjusting every line of the uniform. My insignia caught the soft light of dawn. Silver eagle, centered. My nameplate burnished just enough to reflect back clarity. In the room downstairs, no one stirred. Mom was probably still asleep. Dad already at the office rehearsing talking points. Eli fine-tuning a slideshow that would try unknowingly to earn my approval. I didn't leave a note, just the silence of a woman who no longer needed their blessing. Outside, frost dusted the windshield of my government-issued black sedan. I cleared it slowly, methodically, my breath forming clouds as I moved. Calm hands, steady movements. I wasn't nervous. I'd been through combat simulations more chaotic than any boardroom. But I was keenly aware that this was no ordinary meeting. This was a reckoning. The Langford Systems campus sat like a polished kingdom of glass and steel. I'd been there once years ago when Dad still thought I might shadow him for a summer. But today, I wasn't a guest. Today, I was the Pentagon liaison for Project Valor, and the company pitching my brothers, my father's legacy. I walked through security with practiced ease. My badge opened the inner gates. I could feel eyes shift as I passed. A few murmured greetings. Some stood a little straighter. Others simply stared, unsure how to process the presence of someone who looked young, female, composed, and held authority over the biggest defense contract on their table. I made my way to the executive floor. My heel struck the marble with a deliberate rhythm. No hesitation, no apology. Then I saw him. Eli, standing by the window tablet in hand, blazer-sharp hair, deliberately tousled corporate, effortless. He looked up, expecting some assistant, maybe a project coordinator. And then he saw me. His jaw didn't drop. That would have been too honest. But his expression did stutter, eyes widening posture, tightening breath, catching for just a second too long. "Celia?" he asked. "What is this?" I didn't stop walking. "Good morning, Mr. Hartman," I said, voice cool, clipped. "I'm here for the Valor Review." Before he could respond, our father's voice boomed from the other side of the hallway. "Eli, did you get the—" He turned the corner and froze. The colour drained from his face so gradually it was almost elegant. His eyes scanned the uniform, then the badge. Then the silence grew heavy. "Celia," he said, trying to find his footing. Why didn't you tell?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Just then, a voice rang out from the inner door. "Colonel Hartman." A tall man in a dark suit stepped forward, Langford's executive vice president. "My father's boss?" He smiled and extended a hand. "We're honoured you're joining us in person. This way, please." He glanced at Eli and Dad. "Didn't know you were related to the liaison. Small world." And then he said it. "Mom, let me escort you to the head of the table." Mom. That single word landed like a thunderclap. The kind you feel in your chest, not your ears. Dad didn't move. Eli lowered his tablet, and I smiled politely and walked past them, because no one needed to argue anymore. The hierarchy had spoken. Not mine, his. The room was all glass and gloss, but the air shifted when I entered. Executives stood. Engineers paused mid-sentence. They'd seen my title on paper. Now they were seeing me in person. I took my seat. Not on the side, not in the background. But next to the EVP, the nameplate is already in place. I opened my notes, checked the agenda, and waited. Just before the meeting began, my phone vibrated once. A new email. From Avery. No subject line. Just one sentence. "You were always more than they saw." I didn't reply, but I read it twice. Then, once more. The door shut. The meeting began. And I spoke first. But the night before the hours before all this began, I was standing alone in the room I hadn't slept in for 5 years, laying out a suit they told me never fit. It was black. Clean lines, single-breasted, subtle satin trim at the lapel. Nothing loud, nothing that begged for attention. Just sharpness, honesty, presence. A uniform of a different kind. I laid it across the desk like a statement only I needed to understand. 5 years ago, when I first wore it to a defence symposium in Zurich, I had emailed a photo home. Just a hopeful daughter in a perfect suit standing in front of her first keynote banner. My mother never replied to the email, but 2 weeks later on a phone call she mentioned it, casually. "You look intense," she said, like she was complimenting a funeral flower arrangement. "Just be careful, Celia." That kind of look too cold, too masculine people might find it off-putting. I remember laughing politely, pretending not to feel gutted. I hadn't worn that suit around her since. Until now. Because that same suit had walked me into rooms I had no invitation to until I made one. It had stood at the front of war rooms, and policy briefings had helped me hold my spine straight when I was the youngest and the only woman and the only voice with a dissenting view. It hadn't made me who I was, but it had never once betrayed who I'd become. I ran a hand along the sleeve. My fingers trembled not from doubt, but from the weight of knowing exactly how far I'd come. Still fits. I turned. Avery stood in the doorway, her arms tucked around her waist, her silhouette barely lit by the hallway light. She hadn't knocked. She never needed to. Her eyes moved from the suit to me, to the open suitcase on the bed, to the laptop still aglow with briefing notes. She stepped forward, hesitant but unafraid. "I remember that one," she said. Her voice was almost reverent. "It's done some travelling," I replied. "It looks different now." She tilted her head. "It doesn't wear you anymore. You wear it." We both smiled, but only briefly, because we both knew what she was really saying. "Do you ever think about how many versions of you they missed?" she asked softly. I took a breath. I used to think if I just worked hard enough, earned enough, maybe they'd catch up. And now I know it's not my job to shrink myself to fit their view. She stepped closer, reached out. Her fingers touched the cuff of my blazer. "You look like power," she said. It was barely more than a whisper, but it thundered in me. When I was 17, Avery once told me she wanted to be like me when she grew up, not because I was smart, but because I walked into rooms like I belonged in them. I had forgotten she said that. Until now. We stood there for a moment, two women, raised in a family that only knew how to praise certain kinds of sons. Then she did something that undid me more than all the applause in Berlin ever could. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out something small. Folded. Worn. She held it between two fingers and pressed it into my hand. "You left this in my room the day you left," she said. "I never showed it to anyone." I unfolded it. My own handwriting, a letter I wrote in the dark with shaky hands and a heart full of exhaustion and hope. Avery. "If no one tells you you're enough, I will. You're allowed to be quiet and still matter. You're allowed to feel big things and say nothing. You're allowed to wait until you're ready to speak. But just so you know, you're already worth hearing. Love, Ceci." I stared at it, then at her. She was blinking fast now. "You were always the only one who saw me," I said quietly. "I didn't speak up," she replied. "I should have." "You were surviving," I said. "We both were." Avery stepped back just a little, enough to look at the suit again. "They're not ready for who you are," she said, "but you are." I nodded. "That's all that matters." She touched my shoulder. "Tomorrow, they'll see." "Not because I need them to," I said, "but because it's time." She left the room with a nod, and I turned back to the suit. I slipped into it slowly, every button, every crease an act of reclaiming. I tightened the cuff, ran a brush over my shoulders, and checked the mirror. And then I smiled. Not because I looked like someone they'd finally admire, but because I looked like someone I already did. By 7:15 the next morning, I was parked outside Langford Systems, sleek glass walls, stainless steel accents, and a security entrance that buzzed with early arrivals and coffee-fueled urgency. The air was sharp with pre-storm humidity, but I felt clear. Grounded. Tailored black suit, pressed into quiet, precision badge clipped to my lapel briefcase in hand. The only thing louder than my heels on the concrete was the silence I carried inside me. Heavy, measured, deliberate. Avery had texted me one word that morning. Ready? I hadn't replied. She would understand. This wasn't a morning for talking. It was a morning for showing up. Inside the reception area gleamed too white, too polished. A little too desperate to impress. Just past the security scanners I saw him. Eli. He was leaning against the admin desk, half turning as he laughed with some junior project lead. A blue folder in his hand, his hair swept back like a man in control. When he saw me, he blinked. For a moment, something unreadable passed across his face. Then came the smile. Tight. Pitying. The kind of smile people wear when they think they're still the protagonist. "Celia," he said, arms wide, as if greeting a long-lost acquaintance, not his sister. "Didn't expect to see you so early. You consulting today, or just auditing for old time's sake?" His tone was the same one he used at the dinner table, that practiced playfulness laced with condescension. "I'm here for the briefing," I said evenly. "Oh, right, the guest list." He glanced at the receptionist, who was already watching us, with a flicker of curiosity. "You know, I wasn't sure you were still doing this kind of work. Thought you'd moved on to whatever you people call lateral deployments." The joke wasn't funny, but he grinned like it was. My father, a few steps behind him, gave me a look that wasn't quite recognition. More like acknowledgement of presence, how you'd nod at someone you passed in the elevator, not your own daughter. He adjusted his tie eyes, sliding away. "Celia," he said. "Didn't realize you'd be attending this one." "Good to see you too, Dad." He nodded, already turning toward Eli, already letting his body language close the loop I'd never been invited into. I could have said something. Anything. But I had no need to disrupt the illusion. Let them play their parts. The stage had already shifted beneath their feet. Then I saw her. Avery. She was standing by the admin desk, wearing her navy cardigan and a pair of oversized tortoiseshell glasses that made her look half young, half wise. She wasn't holding a clipboard, wasn't part of the show, but she was there watching. When our eyes met, her expression flickered, nervous, almost guilty. Then she did something that caught me entirely off guard. She smiled. It was small, just a quiet upturn of the mouth. But it wasn't uncertain. It was proud. She didn't wave, didn't approach, just stood there, a silent anchor in the tide of the morning rush. And that was enough. I gave the receptionist my name. She glanced down, brows lifting slightly when she saw it printed at the top of the day's briefing notes. "Ah, yes. You're expected. Conference room 14C. They've already set your materials. Already set." The words landed gently, but their meaning rang clear. I walked past Eli, past my father, past the history they thought still defined me, and as the elevator doors slid open, I didn't look back. Langford Systems' executive floor had changed since I'd last been here. Sleeker, more sterile. But some things hadn't. The photos on the hallway walls still showcased Eli's face at half a dozen milestone events. Product launches, government partnerships, and defence contracts signed with tight handshakes and borrowed pride. His story carved in brushed metal and backlighting. But now, my name was here too. Not on the wall, not yet, but on the placard at the head of the conference table. Director Celia Hartman, Pentagon Liaison. I stood at the door for a moment before stepping in. Everything inside was neutral glass panels, chrome fixtures, a long dark wood table. But on that table, dead center, was my seat, my materials, my agenda, my moment. I pulled out the chair, laid down my briefcase and sat. The room would fill soon, with engineers, executives, decision-makers who still thought Eli's name carried the weight, and then they'd see mine. They'd see it wasn't weight that mattered, it was gravity, and today I owned the center of it. The quiet click of the conference room door pulled every pair of eyes to me. Celia Hartman seated at the head of the table. At least 20 people numbered engineer leads, budget analysts, security specialists, and not one of them was willing to pretend this wasn't a departure from expectation. Then the real shift came. The CEO arrived, Richard Langford, my father's former boss, one of the most respected names in defence, contracting a man whose handshake had closed billions in contracts and whose arrival could silence a room. He stopped in the doorway. The title on my placard reflected in his eyes before he spoke. Director Hartman. Ma'am. His voice was warm, authoritative, and genuine. Your presence honours us. My father, Greg Hartman, who used to stand only taller in my presence, sat rigid beside Eli. His face was colourless, posture was stiff. The CEO's words held a kindness that froze him in clearer relief. Michael Eli, my brother known as Eli in some circles, shifted beside our father, mouth half-open, eyes flicking between me, his boss, and Dad. That attempt at surprise dissolved into a silent question. What happens now? Greg, the CEO, said, turning as if offering an introduction. This is your daughter, Director Celia Hartman. There was no small smile, only an acknowledgement that was more electric than applause. Greg swallowed his throat, moving unnaturally. He cleared his throat. I thought he might speak. Instead, he exhaled and remained mute. Eli finally broke the hush. Celia? I didn't, he stammered. Even now, during protocol, he was disarmed. The power dynamic had shifted, and he'd never paused to suspect how tilted it already was. Around the table, murmurs broke against the polished surface like pebbles against glass. Eyes found me leaning forward, seeking every hint of what this meant. If he had paused before, he'd never again know me as someone to laugh off. From the little window beside the door, the interior glass that let the hallway catch every boardroom moment, I saw Avery pressed against the wall letter, still in her hand. Her face was pale, her thumb curled over the paper's edge. She looked almost like she couldn't believe this was real, as if years hadn't passed. I offered a polite inclination of my chin, an introduction that required neither words nor apology. It said, I'm here. I belong. Mr. Langford held a moment looking at me as though he'd discovered what he'd been missing. It's an honour, he repeated, then turned to Dad. It must mean a great deal. My father's face jerked a breath in, but no sound followed. I realised he couldn't manufacture a response that matched the moment. I understood. Moments like this don't come with rehearsals. The CEO stepped around the table with quiet confidence and chose his seat opposite me. The pivot of presence felt balanced. Two forces aligned, something old and something new, two sides to the same coin. Eli lowered himself beside Dad, the coach who felt responsible for a player who had discovered he was not the only one who could carry the ball. The engineers and analysts seated around us arranged themselves with silent awareness. They knew who had the authority now. They had waited for this room to stop feeling like a challenge and start feeling like a stage. The CEO opened his laptop. Before we begin Project Valor, he said, addressing the room, I want to say how important it is that we have our Pentagon liaison here, Director Hartman. Thank you. My voice was calm but clear. I'm honoured to be here. He nodded and turned to Dad. Your son is presenting first, I understand. He nodded toward Eli, who cleared his throat. But something had changed. His confidence wasn't gone, but it had shifted. His voice came out more measured, more aware. He began his presentation on Phase 2's integration plan. I listened. Yes, I knew the lines. Yes, I could have interrupted early. But I waited. I let him speak. Because my presence meant I didn't need to play coach. When he finished, the room stayed quiet for a heartbeat longer than any briefing silence I'd seen before. Thank you, Eli, I said evenly. Your outline is solid, but we have to talk about your latency benchmarks. Eli blinked again. I kept my tone even neutral. In the last Pentagon memo, our threshold for real-time data exchange is set at 150 milliseconds max. Your proposal targets 220 under peak load conditions. That won't fly, he swallowed. He looked back at the charts he'd prepared. The murmurs of uncertainty began. I turned to logistics, valuable work. But you'll need to revise. His voice cracked just slightly. Yes, ma'am. I understand. Mr. Langford nodded. The room shifted again. Double-checking, confirming, measuring. The weight of that one word ma'am echoed. It wasn't meant to undermine him. It was meant to define accountability. After he spoke, the meeting resumed. I guided the next questions. Would the backup system reduce response time? What documentation would need to be submitted to the Pentagon oversight? When would testing milestones be delivered? For once, there were no deflected questions to my father, no sideways glances at my brother waiting to determine if this was someone to respect. Was everyone looking at me, listening, engaging? I glanced once at Dad, seated next to Eli, and I saw something shift in his face. Not shame, not blame. Respect, surprise, relief. Avery might not have the confidence to speak aloud, but her phone vibrated in her hand as she stood in her corridor post. I knew she'd seen the pivot, the gravity. The room ended with final signatures and logistics clearances. I stood. Mr. Langford stood. We exchanged a nod, the kind two professionals give when a bridge is built. The team filed out. People shook my hand. They thanked me for clarity, for guidance, for leadership. Eli shook it too. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. My father approached as the last of the group left the floor. His gait was still rigid, but there was something woman in his face, something unspoken that needed no coaching. Celia, he said, voice softer than it had been since I was 13, and too shy to raise my hand in class. You were right. I let that sit before replying. Yes, I was. He nodded again, then stepped aside. As if it were my place now. I gathered my notes, the printed margins now marked up with commentary. I closed my laptop. At the doorway, I caught Avery looking through the glass. She folded the letter in her hand, pressed it to her heart. She didn't clap. She didn't wave. But she smiled. It broke something open like the first rain after drought. I turned back toward the boardroom where the final segment of the presentation remained. The room had settled into a quieter rhythm, now more focused, more tense. My name still etched onto the placard at the table's head felt no longer like a surprise, but a confirmation. A promise I earned this. Eli's slides flickered across the screen again. He was attempting to explain the architecture of the fallback encryption model, glossing over its limitations, as if hopeful no one would look too closely. In the past, maybe they wouldn't have. Not when the Hartman name was still shorthand for pedigree, but this wasn't the past. And my silence wasn't protection anymore. It was a choice, and I'd made a different one. I leaned forward. Eli, I said, tone calm, clipped almost gentle, walk me through your logic for isolating the tertiary node under a level 3 breach scenario. He blinked. Sure. Well, the idea is to segment and reroute traffic, assuming the internal firewall layers hold. His cursor danced uncertainly across the diagram. And if they don't, I asked, he paused, we'd fail over to local instance protocols. My brow lifted. You're proposing a full failover to site-level protections during a national breach. Well, the odds, that's exactly what the protocol's designed for, I said. We have standards now. This model doesn't meet them. A silence bloomed around the table. It wasn't hostile, it was educational. The kind of stillness that precedes a collective note-taking. You'll need to revise that portion, I added, voice steady. We're not in 2014 anymore. You know that. He nodded quickly, his mouth forming the shape of acknowledgement, even if his pride hadn't caught up yet. Yes, ma'am, he said a little softer this time, almost respectfully. To his credit, he didn't argue, and for the first time since we were children, I realised something unsettling. He wasn't used to being challenged, not like this. Not from someone who had once disappeared quietly so he could be the star. Now, I wasn't disappearing. I was sitting at the table. I turned next to the systems engineer seated on my left. Let's walk through your proposed multi-point authentication failsafe. Are you planning biometrics in Tier 2 or 3? Her eyes widened, but she responded with clarity. Tier 3, Mum, for mobile field ops. Good, I said, tapping my pen to my notebook. Let's revisit the latency modelling after lunch. I want real field data, not just projections. I asked question after question, technical, strategic, even ethical. Not because I needed to prove I was smarter, but because I needed to prove the room mattered. That excellence wasn't optional. That the badge on my blazer wasn't just earned, it was functional. Across the hall, I caught a glimpse of Avery again. She had moved slightly, pressing closer to the door, the light catching on her earrings, small silver stars I'd once given her for her 15th birthday. She still wore them. It felt like a signal. She watched me the way someone watches a painting that makes sense of their own thoughts. With awe, yes, but also with familiarity. The kind that says, you were always this. I just didn't know how to name it. When the meeting adjourned for lunch, Langford stood and offered a measured, outstanding clarity Director Hartman. I nodded, glad to contribute. The others filed out quietly. I gathered my things, slowly feeling the shift in weight around me. This wasn't just personal vindication, it was cultural inversion, a redrawing of the lines. In the hallway, Eli approached. His voice was almost cautious. You didn't have to go that hard. I turned to him. I didn't go hard. I went accurately. He nodded once, rubbing the back of his neck. I guess I've gotten used to being the smartest guy in the room. I didn't smile. That's always dangerous. He let out a breath, half laugh, half admission. You were good. I mean it. Good. Thank you, I said, and I meant that too. Then he hesitated. Have you ever missed it? Miss what? Being part of this, our family, the company, the old life? I thought of Avery watching from the hallway, of her small silver stars, of how long it had taken for anyone in that house to understand who I was becoming. No, I said gently, because I never really belonged to that life. I was just surviving it. He didn't argue. He just stepped aside as I passed, this time not trying to speak over me. As I walked toward the lobby, Avery met me halfway. She was holding the letter, still creased and worn now from her palms. She looked at me with something new in her eyes. Not just admiration. Permission. I watched you, she said softly, and something shifted. I raised an eyebrow, shifted. She bit her lip. I think maybe I can speak now too. And for the first time, I believed she could. We didn't say anything else in the hallway. We didn't need to. Sometimes the most honest conversations are made from breath and posture and the soft miracle of someone finally choosing to stand still instead of turning away. Later that afternoon, after most of the executives had left and the polished hallway lights had dimmed to their evening hush, I received the message, Conference Room D. They want to talk. It wasn't signed, but I didn't need it to be. The room was smaller than the one we'd met in that morning. No windows, no performance lighting, no projection screens. Just a table, 2 carafes of water, and my mother and father seated like opposing counsel. Eli stood by the far wall, arms folded, gaze uncertain. And behind them, near the doorway, was Avery. She didn't take a seat. She stood with her back straight and her hands clasped in front of her, not in submission, but in resolve. My father started. You should have told us, Celia. I did, I said. He looked at me like I was speaking another language. Don't be clever. I stepped forward. I'm not. I told you when I was accepted into the International Security Fellowship. I emailed when I was named director. I sent the promotion letter. You didn't read them. My mother shook her head. You didn't explain. We didn't know what any of that meant. I stopped explaining when it became clear you weren't listening, I said. You heard what you wanted to hear. Military, and assumed I was a logistics clerk or someone who holds a walkie-talkie. My father's voice sharpened. That's not fair, isn't it? I asked, calm but steady. When I joined Cyber Command, you said I was throwing away my potential. You never asked what I was building instead. The air thinned, that kind of quiet that presses against your ears. Eli looked between us, awkwardly shifting his weight. Look, this doesn't have to be... I'm not angry anymore, I said, and it surprised me how true it felt. But I am done pretending your ignorance was accidental. Avery's breath hitched. I glanced toward her. She was trembling slightly like a bowstring pulled tight. Then she spoke. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it cut through the room like sunlight through stained glass. She always tried, Avery said. 3 words, measured, painfully clear. My mother turned, startled. Avery, she always tried, Avery said again. Letters, calls, invitations. You didn't want to see her. Her voice broke just slightly on the last word. You thought her leaving meant she was erasing you. But you erased her first every time you skipped over her name in conversation. Every time you acted like Eli was the only one worth being proud of. My father looked stricken. Not furious, not even defensive, just startled. Like he'd finally stepped in front of a mirror that showed his reflection clearly. My mother looked down at her hands. I wanted to go to Avery then. To reach for her hand to let her know how much it meant that she spoke. But I didn't move. I let her have that moment as hers. I kept the letter she wrote when she left. Avery said, voice softer now. I read it when I needed to remember what courage looked like. My mother's eyes filled with tears. She didn't wipe them away. Silence again. This time not oppressive, but sacred, like something had broken. Or begun. You've built something we didn't understand, my father finally said. But we see it now. At least, we're trying to. Trying is a start, I said. He stood slowly like the weight of years had just added itself to his spine. I underestimated you. I know. And I'm sorry. I know that too. He stepped forward. I didn't flinch, I didn't retreat. And when he opened his arms, I didn't immediately walk into them. But I didn't walk away either. My mother stood as well. Her hand brushed mine. It was small, tentative. But it stayed. Behind them, Avery exhaled. And for the first time in a very long time, it didn't sound like someone carrying the weight of someone else's silence. That Friday evening, my apartment glowed with soft golden light. Nothing extravagant, just the kind of brightness that comes when a place is finally filled with the right kind of presence. My dining table, once an afterthought of minimalist design and military precision, now held mismatched ceramic dishes, a linen runner I'd picked up in Florence, and 6 chairs. All filled. It was the first time I'd hosted dinner for my family. The first time they came to a table where I led, not with resistance, but with welcome. My father arrived first, carrying a framed article tucked under his arm. He held it with both hands as if it were a fragile relic. I thought maybe you'd want this, he said quietly. It was a print copy of the Defense Weekly profile from last month, Director Celia Hartman, and The Silent Revolution in Integrated Systems. There was my picture in uniform standing beside a wall of servers, a headline I used to dream someone else would write about me. I took the frame gently. Thank you, I said. It means something. And it did. My mother came next with a pie in a warm tin, wrapped in an old dish towel I hadn't seen since I was 12. Apple, she said, then paused, almost uncertain. Still, your favourite right, it is, I replied, and smiled. She exhaled with something like relief. Then came Avery. She stepped in, carrying 2 things. First, the letter I had written her the night I left. She'd placed it in a clear archival sleeve, the edges soft and frayed, but intact. I thought maybe it belonged back with you, she said. But when I reached for it, she hesitated. Or maybe with both of us. The second item was a framed diagram, one of my earliest blueprints, from a research proposal at the Global Cyber Summit. She must have found it online. Printed, aligned, preserved. It looked almost sacred under the glass. I couldn't speak. Then she said, looking at the frame, not at me, but I could understand, and I never stopped. I set the frame on the bookshelf next to my defence medals, and the letter I tucked inside the drawer of my desk. Not hidden, just kept, like something that grew up with me. The meal was simple: roast vegetables, honey-glazed chicken, and garlic bread I'd learned to make from a friend in Ankara. The wine wasn't from a country club cellar, it was a bottle Avery had chosen because she liked the label. "It looks like you," she'd said, pointing to the fierce blue ink swells on the glass. We laughed. Real laughter. Not polite, not staged. And no one interrupted anyone else to correct the story or redirect the spotlight. At the end of the night, after the dishes were cleared and the coffee poured, my father stood to offer a toast. To Celia, he said, "Not just for what you've accomplished, but for doing it even when no one was looking. You taught us that leadership isn't loud, it's deliberate, and you didn't need to follow anyone's map to make something worth arriving at." He raised his glass to the table she built and the seat she claimed. We clinked glasses. My eyes shimmered, but I held the tears. I wanted to feel it, not blur it. Avery cleared her throat. Her voice was quieter than the toast, but it echoed more deeply. "You gave me courage," she said, without ever asking for anything in return. I didn't answer right away. I just reached across the table and took her hand. Because that's what legacy really is. Not headlines, not medals, but the quiet turning of one person's strength into another's beginning. That night, as the candles burned low and the apartment softened into quiet again, I walked to the window and looked out at the city. My life, my light. They once said I was cold, too masculine, not right for the path they charted, but they never understood what didn't fit them was exactly what fit me. I never needed their recognition to become real. I already was, and so are you. If you've ever felt unseen, underestimated, or called too much for simply being yourself, remember this: the most undeniable power is showing up whole when no one expected you to. Not for revenge, not for applause, but because you belong. And you always did. Drop your stories in the comments, someone else might be waiting to hear them.